Your last summer school assignment is done. So please log into Realm and take a quiz to be sure you listen to your assignment today. Just kidding. Our This American Life sermon series does end today, and with the show entitled simply Neighbors. It starts with a squabble between someone using the name Love Your Neighbor and another using Love Thy Neighbor. Wouldn't Shakespeare be proud? Love Your Neighbor is suing Love Thy Neighbor, and Jesus wept. Now, for normal, healthy people, it's just a silly story. But for recovering trademark attorneys everywhere, it feels a lot more like a hangover. A minister in Detroit used the term love your neighbor to sell her beads and clothing that she advertised in the USA Today. I'm trying not to judge, but it just comes naturally. And she was suing a ministry that was feeding the homeless and using the name Love Thy Neighbor. Let me ruin the ending for you all. No one wins but the lawyers in cases like this. Which is why it had such a familiar ring to me. And a case I had when I practiced trademark law. My client was a South African company owned entirely by women who trained and employed other women all over Africa impacted by the HIV/AIDS epidemic there. They trained them to make candles in their home, and it was a cooperative, and it was going great. It was a way to earn money while caring for their children, not having to leave, until we got the notice. A golf resort on Maui had decided it wanted to have, among its many offerings in its gift shops, flashlights, lighters, and maybe candles. And since the name of the African candle company was close to the name of the resort, certainly how it sounded, and flashlights and lighters were close to candles, the resort moved to cancel entirely the name of the candle cooperative that they'd been using for 5 years, the name it had built a worldwide business upon. So I get the letter, and I'm like, oh, this is from Hawaii. Like, those people are nice, right? I'll just call the lawyer up. It'll be fine, and I'll explain, and all will be well. But he would not budge, I tell you. And after going back and forth and filing some motions, and something started to well up in me. It was warm and it felt good. It felt powerful. It might have even tasted yummy, like a ube pina colada vegan donut. Oh, yeah. It was like an old friend, and I knew it well. Righteous indignation. Oh, and it had a plan, friends. And I don't think I'm alone on this, right? We have been there. What was I gonna do? I was gonna expose this resort to the world for what they were doing. Oh, and I would call the press. Remember when there was a press? I would call the press and hold this lawyer up to personal and professional ridicule. Yeah. And I would take this all on what? Pro bono. My personal cause. I wouldn't even bill my time. All the partners were like, whoa, TJ. Okay. I was gonna show them though. And then after some letters and some simple edits to some documents in the trademark office, we reached the most boring of all endings to any trademark case: a coexistence agreement. I'll tell you all about it the next time you can't sleep. But my client was able to continue their work on behalf of those they served. And in a parting letter, I might have suggested that my opponent pass on my relief to their client, that tourists would be able to buy their pocket flashlights from a gift shop on the other side of the world, unfettered by any potential confusion with a women's candle-making cooperative just trying to lift families out of poverty. I know you wanted it, I know. Who here is a neighbor? Yeah, all right, I got the right crowd. What is a neighbor? Oh, the silence into which a sermon must launch. At the very basic level, they are people we have a coexistence agreement with. The sermon's going right on a track, friends. None of this stuff I do. On our streets, in our grocery stores, at movie theaters, through apartment walls and floors, even at the ends of our driveways where people keep parking their cars. Whew, last week was rough. In all these relations, well, you might be more evolved than I am, but in most of these relations, many of us battle this feeling we all know so well, this feeling of being totally right, and then being indignant that others do not see it. It reminds me of the parable of the negligent neighbor. One day, an old neighbor saw a new family moving in across the street. When the moving helpers had gone, he saw that they had a toddler. As the old neighbor was minding his own business, he saw the toddler come out into the front yard. The old neighbor was afraid because the child was walking closer and closer to the street. The neighbor could not understand where the parents were. He was furious. What kind of parents let a child wander by the street alone? And he had it. He marched over to the new family on the block. He rapped on the door and he yelled, "Your child is unattended in the yard and walking right into the road." The new neighbor went to the yard and called loudly for the child, who came right away. And the old neighbor waited for the new neighbor to discipline that child and thank him for what he'd spotted. Then the new neighbor looked right at the old neighbor and said, "Why didn't you help her? What is wrong with you?" That's right. Someone shared this story with me rather quickly when I had moved to the islands of Hawaii, to illustrate there was a different idea of neighborliness there. That the values of the land are such that people really do care for one another's families who are nearby somewhat differently than in places I might have lived. There is an expectation of community involvement in caring for children there that is not found in as many places as I wish on this continent now. In fact, the very foundation of the Hawaiian religion is the belief that every human is physically related to each other by blood and equally related to the land or the aina as family, not simply as inhabitants, certainly not in a domination role. And that connection plays out in ways very different than other places I've lived, and in one way I do miss this difference really shines. At the end of public gatherings or meetings there, not all the time, but often, at the end of sporting events, certainly at the ends of hula presentations, even at the end of some civic meetings and political gatherings, it's customary to sing together, to hold hands and sway as if the breeze is blowing in the room. And this is usually the song you sing. E Hawaii e kuone hana e kuhome kulaivine oli noa ina pono lanio e Hawaii aloha e haoli na o pio Hawaii ne oli Mana he ahe makani apamaine. Mau ke aloha no Hawaii. The word pono in the song can be translated as righteousness. And the song sings about the blessings of heaven and rejoices at the happiness of youth. And ends by saying, in the direction that breezes blow, always aloha for Hawaii. Many believe that Hawaii's lands are unlawfully occupied. I'm not just being dramatic, though it's a favorite gear of mine. The Hawaiian monarchy was overthrown at gunpoint, commanded by a U.S. naval officer at the end of the 19th century. Queen Liliuokalani was given the choice to die herself, knowing her people would be killed after she was, or to abdicate to a small group of commercial interests who wanted absolute control of the islands and their resources. She chose abdication and then was held prisoner in a small corner of her own palace for years. This was 1893, friends, not centuries ago, a few generations. Just imagine how ready, how potent could be the feelings of righteous indignation of the Hawaiian people who waited for relief from the worst wildfire in a century. Relief that eventually came by boat, all while the most well-equipped military force in the world, the same military that played a decisive role in the violent overthrow of those lands in the first place, sat motionless, unresponsive, a mere 100 miles offshore, who could have been flown in with supplies in minutes. Any amount of indignation, righteousness, or otherwise would make sense. And I know some was there. But there was also so much more. I got a call Friday from one of my friends on Maui. He's an immigration lawyer there. A lot of people don't know this, but a large percentage of the people who lost their homes in Lahaina in the fires are Mexican and Central American immigrants. They come to Hawaii frequently to work on the coffee farms there. This lawyer who called me fights for many in that community so that they can receive the asylum they are entitled to under U.S. and international law. We became friends quickly in Hawaii when he found out I was a minister, because we had this little routine in especially hard cases where a judge was being sort of tough and not listening to reason. I would show up for his hearings in immigration court in my collar, and I would just sit in the back praying. For real, I mean, it was real. It just had the added benefit of making the judge kind of wonder, what's going on there? always, my friend swore, acting a little more favorably to his client there. And my partner in averting those crimes, this lawyer told me about a community meeting in Lahaina that he was at where families were sharing that their gravest concern was that their documentation of their lawful presence in the United States was incinerated in the blaze. These are people who had homes 2 weeks ago and are living with their children in beach parks now, outdoors. But it was losing their documents that scared them the most. Tells you something about what we do to migrants in this country. And without giving it much thought, he told me he just stood up and said to more than 100 people at this community meeting, I will help you get your documents replaced and I'll do it for free. My friend is not wealthy. Just days before, when the fire was coming very close to his home, some of our friends showed up to help him literally stamp out the fires in his yard. He's also a proud grandpa to a few grandkids now. These things don't make him wealthy, neither does giving away free legal services to those in need, though some donations to his Venmo for legal services have been coming in, he reported to me. They don't make him wealthy, but they sure make him rich. He wasn't even calling to tell me this story. He was calling to check in on me. From a place literally on fire, he was checking on me. Because the friend I told many of you about in November, my worship technician through the COVID lockdown, Stuart, whose wedding I flew to perform after he received a cancer diagnosis last year, succumbed this week to his battle with cancer. And my friend, whose house was literally on fire, was calling to check on me, to see how I'm doing. Talk about loving your neighbor. There are words that come after love thy neighbor in the Gospel of Matthew. And I'm not talking about the church in Georgia that registered the phrase, and I quote, "That love thy neighbor thing, I meant that, signed God." Or the restaurant in Alabama that registered, "Love thy neighbor, feed them barbecue." No, what is it? As thyself. Bless you. In our reading, poet and law professor Helani K. Trask, who I don't mind saying was a legend in her righteous indignation, was also part of one of the oldest and most revered families from Maui. And she died just a few years ago. She writes, "Into our light I will go forever." She names the most sacred foods and plants in the Hawaiian religion and culture, and some of the most sacred places. Her poem is a geography and a map of all that surrounds her, of all the neighborhoods and neighbors that touched her life, of all she lovingly coexists with. She speaks of going into all these places and in the end being drunk on the mana, which is hard to translate but means spirit or soul or essence. Drunk on the mana of Hawaii. One of my first interactions with Hawaii when I did not understand the place at all was one of righteous indignation that led to a coexistence agreement that left me with sort of a hangover. My most recent experience of seeing my friends care for one another in Maui in powerful and life-altering ways, and watching a friend I made in those lands, who I loved so dearly, walk now into our light forever. Leaves me drunk on the mana of Hawaii, but in the best way. There are neighbors everywhere. There are places everywhere into which we must bring our light. And I don't mean the light of this church. I don't even mean the light of this faith. I'm talking about us now. Me and you, each one of you, each one of us. The vision we must hone is to see the child in our neighbor. The young boy splashing in the water, the young girl too close to the street. And love that child however we can. Love thy neighbor. And alongside that love, friends, we invite the sacred practice of being exactly, unapologetically, who we are. Being bravely and entirely ourselves. Being who you love to be and who you delight in being. And loving that person, loving who you are. The as yourself part. Because that's the only way, it's really the only way we can truly love a neighbor. Love yourself not in the ways you think you're supposed to, not in the ways that television tells you to, or how anyone selling you things tells you you ought to, but in the way that connects you viscerally with one another, in the way that ties you so closely to the land that it might be your actual blood relative. Sometimes the radical love we need isn't for the person pushing your buttons, but for the person who's got those buttons installed. Because as you love yourself, so will you love your neighbor. That's the logic. Trust me on this one, friends. None of us has as much time as we think. This faith I love pays attention to the songs, to the words of those who cry for justice. This faith I love honors the struggles of the heroes who have for centuries been unabashedly themselves, no matter what. This faith I love, through its struggles, through my struggles, has loved me exactly for myself. This faith I love loves me back. This faith I love loves you back. And any faith that won't do that, I was about to get a little righteously indignant there. Amen. That's right. Any faith that won't do, yeah, okay, gonna let it go. Instead, let me quote the great saint, Fred Rogers, and tell you this in case no one said it to you yet today. I do love you. I really do. But more importantly, I like you just the way you are. You're hearing me, right? Can I get an amen? Amen. May it ever be so. Blessed be and aloha.